Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
"I do not have gold," came her father's voice, a familiar cadence she had heard deliver 1,000 sermons on the virtues of poverty and the richness of the soul. But this time, the holy timber was thin, stretched taut over a chasm of desperation. Elara Vance froze behind the heavy oak pulpit, the scent of lemon oil, old paper, and melting candle wax suddenly turning rancid in the stifling air of the chapel. She had only slipped in to replace the altar cloths for Sunday service, a simple, pious duty that had defined the 19 years of her life. But the sound that answered her father was anything but holy. It was a low, guttural laugh, thick with a worldly satisfaction that seemed to coat the very air in grime. It was the laugh of a wolf that has finally cornered its prey after a long and patient hunt. "No, Alistair, you never did." The other man, Silas Croft, replied, his voice a gravelly purr that slid through the sacred silence like a serpent. "But you have something better. Something far more valuable to me now. You have a daughter. A debt is a debt, Reverend, and the time for payment has come." A silence descended then, so profound that Elara could hear the frantic, panicked drumming of her own heart against her ribs. In that terrible quiet, a lifetime of faith shattered into a million pieces. She was not a child of God. She was collateral. She was not a beloved daughter. She was currency. She was the final, terrible payment for a sin she never knew had been committed, a ghost debt from a life her father had lived long before he'd ever worn a priest's collar. Here, in the very heart of her sanctuary, under the sorrowful gaze of a stained-glass Christ, her soul had just been sold, and the devil himself, smelling of expensive cigars and cold coin, had come to collect. A primal instinct, deeper than prayer and stronger than fear, screamed from the depths of her being. She could not let this happen. She would run, she would fight, she would be consumed by the unforgiving wilderness and bleached to bone under the New Mexico sun before she would be owned by that man. But could a preacher's daughter, raised on psalms and shielded from the world, truly survive the untamed West that had swallowed so many stronger, harder souls? Her terrifying journey into the unknown begins now, a testament to the fact that the most desperate souls often have the strongest will to survive. Stay with us to witness her harrowing escape and the unexpected destiny that awaits in the dust. If her story of courage touches your heart, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of love born from desperation. Part 1. A Bargain of Souls. The Chapel in Redemption. Gulch was the only world Elara Vance had ever truly known. It was a small, sun-bleached adobe structure that stood as a lonely testament to God in a land of dust, grit, and quiet desperation. For 19 years, its whitewashed walls had been the boundaries of her existence, its narrow, arched windows the only frames through which she viewed the harsh, sprawling territory beyond. Her life was a litany of pious routines. Rising before dawn to knead the communion bread, its yeasty scent a holy perfume in the small parsonage kitchen, spending afternoons meticulously mending the church linens, her needle flashing in the dusty shafts of light, and evenings spent listening to her father, Reverend Alistair Vance, practice his sermons, his voice rising and falling with a practiced thunder that could make the pews tremble. She had always believed that his piety was as solid and unshakable as the mountains on the horizon. She saw him as a spiritual giant, a man who had wrestled with the devil and won, dedicating his life to God as a result. She did not see the fine cracks in his facade, the haunted look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, or the way his hands would sometimes tremble as he clutched the heavy pulpit, less like a preacher and more like a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. On this fateful afternoon, as she slipped into the silent chapel, she felt the familiar peace settle over her. The air was cool and still, a welcome respite from the oppressive heat outside. She ran a hand along the smooth, worn wood of a pew, a muscle memory of a lifetime of prayer. It was from this peaceful vantage that she heard the voices from the vestry, the small room where her father met with the town's troubled souls. But the voice that was not her father's held no trouble, only a chilling, absolute authority. The man he spoke to, Silas Croft, was a specter from a past Elara couldn't have imagined. He was a corpulent man, poured into a tailored eastern suit of dark wool that seemed to absorb the light around it. The dust of Redemption Gulch dared not cling to the polished leather of his boots. He was an invasive species in this arid land, a creature of wealth and shadow. A thick gold ring on his pinky finger glinted as he gestured dismissively, the flash of light like a heliograph signaling doom. She is devout, Silas. A good girl. Her father's voice was strained, the holy timbre she knew so well now replaced by the thin, reedy whine of a desperate merchant hawking his last, most precious ware. She has been raised in the word of the Lord. She will be compliant. Silas Croft stepped out of the vestry and into the main sanctuary, his bulk seeming to diminish the sacred space. He chuckled again, a low, grinding sound that vibrated in Elara's bones. "Oh, I'm not interested in her prayers, Alistair. I'm not interested in her soul. You already gambled that away. I'm interested in the debt. You remember our pact, don't you?" He began to walk slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing like a death knell. California, 49. 2 boys, barely men, with nothing but grit in our teeth and dreams of a mountain made of gold. We were partners. Brothers, you called us. He stopped and ran a gloved hand over the collection plate, a sneer twisting his lips. But when our claim went bust and we were starving in that dusty canyon, you found God. Or so you said. I found reality. I found the last remaining nugget, the one you never knew about, and I used it to build an empire. But before I did, I staked you. I gave you the money to get out of that canyon alive, to come here and build this monument to your own hypocrisy. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. This church, her sanctuary, was built on a lie. That was a lifetime ago. Alistair protested, his voice cracking. A foolish, youthful oath. Oaths made in desperation are the most binding. Reverend, Silas purred, turning to face him, his pale, merciless eyes pinning Alistair to the spot. You swore on your future. You swore on the soul of your firstborn, should you ever have one, that your life would be mine to claim if you ever faltered. And you have faltered. You've begged and borrowed from me for years to keep this pathetic little flock of yours from scattering. The interest has compounded. He took a deliberate step toward the pulpit where Elara was hidden, and she shrank back, her heart seizing. She is all I have left, Alistair whispered, the words a final, pathetic surrender. Silas's smile was devoid of all warmth, a predator's grimace. She is all you have to give, he corrected. And she is more than enough. I'll send a carriage for her at midnight. Have her ready." "And Alistair," he leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial menace, "if she is not there, I will tell your flock about the real foundation of this church. I will tell them how their holy man is nothing but a failed prospector who sold his partner's share for a second chance. Then I will burn this place to the ground with you inside it. And after that, I will find her anyway." The finality in his tone was absolute. As Silas Croft's heavy footsteps receded, leaving the scent of expensive cigars and damnation in their wake, Elara leaned her head against the cool wood of the pulpit, the world tilting on its axis. The sermons of her youth, the hymns she had sung with such fervor, all of it turned to ash in her throat. Her sanctuary had become her auction block. Her father, her shepherd, was the one who had led the wolf to her door. There would be no salvation found within these walls. Her only prayer now was a desperate, silent plea for the strength to escape. Midnight was a deadline, not a destiny. For Elara, the hours between hearing the sentence and its execution were a blur of cold, calculated terror. She stumbled back to the parsonage, moving on autopilot, her mind a maelstrom of shattered faith and nascent fury. The familiar scent of beeswax and her father's pipe smoke, once a comfort, now seemed to choke her. Her bedroom, a small, austere space with a single window overlooking the church graveyard, felt like a prison cell, the walls closing in. For a wild, frantic moment, she considered confronting him, screaming the questions that tore at her throat. How could you? Was my life, my soul, worth so little? But she knew it would be useless. She had heard the finality in Silas Croft's voice, and she had seen the utter collapse in her father's spirit. He was a broken man, and broken men could not protect anyone. There would be no appeal, no reprieve. There was only flight. Tears were a luxury for those who still had hope, a release for those who grieved a loss. Elara felt she had lost everything so completely that there was nothing left to grieve. There was only a hollow, echoing void. The grief would come later, in the wilderness, but for now, there was only the primal, urgent need to survive. She moved with a desperate, silent grace that belied the storm raging within her. Into a small, worn leather satchel, she packed not the things she cherished, but the things that represented a brutal new reality. A block of hardtack from the larder, dry and tasteless, was sustenance. A small tin of matches was fire, warmth, life itself. Her mother's sewing kit was a treasure trove of utility, not for the colorful threads, but for the sturdy needles that could serve as a fishhook or a tool, and the small, sharp scissors. Her hands paused over the heavy, leather-bound family Bible on her nightstand, its cover worn smooth by her father's hypocritical touch. For a moment, she thought of it as a weapon, a heavy object to be thrown. Then, with a surge of bitter resolve, she left it behind. His God and his words were hollow. They had offered her no protection, only a cage. Her final, most precious addition was the one thing that was truly hers, the one object not tainted by her father's lies. Tucked away in a small wooden box was a worn leather cord tied with a small, strange bundle of feathers, hawk, crow, and a single faded crimson feather. It was a mysterious, almost heathen-looking trinket, a legacy from the mother she barely remembered as more than a sad, quiet presence. Her father had always dismissed it, calling it a foolish relic of her mother's fanciful notions. But Elara remembered a rare, vivid moment. Her mother, weak with sickness, pressing it into her small hand and whispering with a strange urgency, "This is who you are. When you are lost, this will guide you home." Home. The word was a cruel mockery now. But the token was a connection to a truth older than her father's betrayal, and she clutched it like a shield as she prepared to step into the abyss. Slipping out the back door of the parsonage was like shedding a skin. Every creak of the floorboards under her thin shoes sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She held her breath as she passed her father's study, seeing a sliver of light from under the door, and imagined him in there, perhaps on his knees, praying for a forgiveness he did not deserve. The thought filled her with a cold, hard strength. The night air was a shock, biting and sharp with the promise of a harsh winter. The moon was a sliver of bone behind a scrim of high, thin clouds, offering little light to guide her. She did not look back. To look back would be to see the ghost of the girl she was, a girl who believed in sermons and a father's love. That girl was dead, buried in the dust of the chapel floor. The wilderness that began abruptly at the edge of the town was a terrifying, infinite blackness. It was a living entity, breathing with the rustle of unseen things in the brush and the distant, lonely howls of coyotes. It was a place of legends and nightmares, of mountain lions and bandits, and men with no laws but their own greed. Yet, it was a better option than the gilded cage Silas Croft had prepared for her. She ran. Her thin Sunday shoes, never meant for more than a polite stroll, were shredded by the rocky terrain. Her lungs burned with the effort, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting of the stars she didn't know how to read. The faint lights of Redemption Gulch vanished, and she was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a tiny speck of defiance in a vast, indifferent landscape. Once, the distant thunder of hooves sent a surge of pure adrenaline through her. She scrambled into a narrow crevice between two towering boulders, pressing herself flat against the cold stone, scarcely daring to breathe. Two riders, their forms silhouetted against the night sky, passed by on the trail below. The swinging light of their lantern cast a malevolent, searching eye across the landscape. Croft's men. She was certain of it. They were hunting her already. The close call left her trembling uncontrollably, but it also hardened her resolve. She pushed deeper into the foothills, away from any established path, trading speed for the safety of the broken, treacherous ground. But adrenaline was a finite resource, and her body, unaccustomed to such brutal exertion, began to betray her. Exhaustion settled in, a heavy, creeping cold that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Her ankle twisted violently on a loose stone, sending a searing, white-hot pain up her leg. She cried out, the sound swallowed by the wind. She stumbled, fell, and pushed herself back up, again and again, her dress torn to ribbons, her hands and knees raw and bleeding. Her vision began to blur, the landscape swimming in and out of focus. Then, the first snowflake landed on her cheek, a touch as cold as a dead man's kiss. The wind, which had been a mournful sigh, rose to a vicious shriek. The snow began to fall in earnest, a hard, driving blizzard that appeared from nowhere, a white fury that erased the land and sky in a matter of minutes. Disoriented, freezing, and crippled with pain, Elara could go no further. She saw the dark shape of a great, gnarled juniper tree, its low sweeping branches offering the barest illusion of shelter, and staggered towards it. She collapsed at its base, her body refusing to obey any further commands. The pain in her ankle faded into a dull, pervasive numbness. The world dissolved into a swirling maelstrom of white. Her last conscious thought was of the feathered token, clutched so tightly in her fist that the leather cord cut into her palm. This will guide you home. Then, she sank into the waiting darkness, the snow beginning to form a soft, cold, and final blanket over her still form. Part 2. Echoes in the Dust. Kaelen moved through the snow-hushed forest like a disembodied spirit, a part of the landscape's own profound silence. The sudden, unseasonable blizzard was a gift from the spirits, driving the deer down from the high ridges, but it was also a lament. The air, thick with falling snow, felt heavy with memory. For Kaelen, every landscape was a map of loss. He could not see a stand of winter aspens without remembering how his wife, Tia, had loved the way their white bark looked like the bones of the earth. He could not feel the bite of the wind without recalling the warmth of her hand in his. He was a man carved from the same stark, beautiful country he inhabited, his features sharp, his eyes holding the patient, watchful quality of a hawk. But beneath the stoic exterior of the Comanche warrior lay a quiet, aching solitude, a hollow space carved out years ago when the white man's fever had stolen Tia from him and left his world silent. He tracked not only for sustenance, but for purpose, for a rhythm to quiet the ghosts of a life that was no more. It was this deep attunement to his surroundings that made him stop. It was not a sound, nor a scent of game on the wind. It was a violation of the natural order. A flicker of color against the vast, monochrome canvas of white and gray, a swatch of blue cotton, nearly buried beneath a juniper bough. His body went rigid, every muscle coiled. His hand moved, not with panic, but with a fluid, practiced economy, to the handle of the bone knife at his belt. His experience with the Tahbai bow, the white man, had been a lesson written in blood and betrayal. They were a people of loud noises, broken promises, and a relentless, hungry greed that consumed everything it touched. His first instinct, the instinct of a warrior tasked with protecting his people, was to fade back into the trees, to leave what was surely a trap or a tragedy to its own grim fate. The troubles of the white man were a plague, and he wanted no part of it. But something held him. The shape under the snow was too small, too still. Curiosity, an emotion he rarely indulged, won out over caution. He moved forward in a low crouch, his moccasins making no sound on the fresh powder, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees for any sign of an ambush. There was nothing. Only the heavy silence of the forest after a storm. He knelt and brushed away the snow. The sight beneath made him pause, a breath catching in his throat. It was a woman, a white woman, her face as pale as porcelain, her lips tinged with the blue of encroaching death. She was young, and even in her frozen, desperate state, there was a fragile beauty to her, like a desert flower blooming defiantly after a rare rain. He saw the dark bruises on her arms, the torn dress, the terror etched onto her features even in unconsciousness. She had been running. From what, or whom, he could guess. A cold, familiar anger stirred within him. This was the way of her people, a casual brutality that was as much a part of them as the color of their skin. He was about to rise and leave her to the spirits when his eyes caught the dark leather cord around her neck, tucked partly inside the collar of her dress. Acting on an impulse he didn't understand, he used the tip of his knife to gently draw it out. His heart stopped. Lying against her pale skin was not a cross, not a locket, but an object he knew better than his own reflection. It was a prayer token, a numunu paha, a small bundle of feathers, hawk, crow, and a single, faded crimson feather from a summer tanager. The binding, the specific knot of sinew, the arrangement itself, it was a signature. It was the token of his mother's clan, the very one his own aunt had worn before she was taken in a raid by settlers 20 years ago, a wound in his family's history that had never fully healed. How? How could this white woman, the embodiment of his people's suffering, possess a sacred sign from the heart of his own family? The question swirled in his mind, a storm as fierce as the one that had just passed. To help her was to risk everything, to invite the chaos of the white world into the sanctuary of his village. To leave her was to abandon a sign so powerful it could only be an act of fate, a message he would be a fool to ignore. The serene face of Tia, even in her final moments, flashed in his mind. She had been the voice of compassion, the one who believed in bridges, not walls. A heart can be its own country, she used to say. Its borders are not made of skin. He looked at the woman's face again, then at the token that lay upon it. This was no longer about a stranger. This was about a spirit, a story that had been lost and had now, impossibly, found its way home. With a quiet sigh that was half prayer, half resignation, he carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile burden against the vast, unforgiving wilderness. The journey back would be long. The questions he would face from his people would be even harder. But for the first time since Tia's passing, he felt a flicker of something beyond duty and grief. He was carrying a mystery back to his people, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his quiet life was about to change forever. Elara awoke not all at once, but in slow, confusing waves. The first sensation was warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to coax her very bones back to life, chasing away the memory of a profound, soul-deep cold. The second was scent, a rich, smoky aroma of cedarwood, mingled with the earthy, unfamiliar smell of tanned hides and wild herbs. The third was weight, a comforting pressure from a pile of heavy, fur-lined robes that covered her. For a long, disoriented moment, she floated in this sensory cocoon, convinced she must be dreaming or dead. But then came the pain, a dull, throbbing ache in her ankle, and the sharp, stinging chorus of a dozen cuts and scrapes. Pain was real. Pain meant she was alive. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus in the dim, fire-lit interior. She was in a circular dwelling, a lodge made of hides stretched over a frame of sturdy wooden poles. The fire in the central pit cast dancing, larger-than-life shadows on walls that were painted with bold symbols of horses, eagles, and sunbursts. It was a place of primal power and beauty, and it terrified her. An old woman sat near the fire, her back straight, her hands methodically grinding something in a stone bowl. Her face was a beautiful, intricate roadmap of wrinkles, each line telling a story Elara could not read. Her long, silver-gray hair was neatly braided with strips of red cloth. This was Lyra. She did not smile, but her eyes, dark and deep as a desert night, held a profound and unnerving sense of calm. Seeing Elara stir, she set aside her bowl, filled a wooden cup with a steaming broth, and moved to her side. She knelt and lifted the cup to Elara's lips. It was a savory, nourishing liquid that tasted of wild game and herbs, and it was the most wonderful thing Elara had ever tasted. She drank greedily, the warmth spreading through her limbs, a lifeline in a sea of fear. Where am I? Elara's voice was a dry, raspy whisper, the words scratching at her throat. Lyra simply placed a single, gentle finger to her own lips. "Rest," she said, her voice like the rustle of dry autumn leaves. "Words can wait. Your spirit must find its way back to your body." Elara obeyed, sinking back into the soft furs, her immediate panic momentarily quieted by the woman's gentle authority. But the peace was a fragile thing, and it was soon shattered. The hide flap covering the entrance was thrust aside, and another woman entered, younger and moving with the sharp, aggressive energy of a striking hawk. She carried a bundle of firewood. This was Naya. She stopped dead when she saw Elara was awake, and her face contorted into a mask of pure, undisguised hostility. She spat a stream of angry-sounding words in a language Elara didn't understand, gesturing towards her with a contemptuous flick of her wrist. Lyra responded in a low, firm tone, and though Elara couldn't comprehend the words, the meaning was universal. A sharp rebuke. With a final, venomous glare at Elara, Naya slammed the firewood onto the ground and stormed out, leaving a wake of palpable animosity. The brief, violent exchange left Elara trembling. She was not a guest here. She was an intruder. Lyra sighed, a weary, ancient sound. "Do not mind her," she said, switching back to English. Naya's heart carries a scar that will not heal. Her parents were killed by soldiers at Sand Creek when she was a child. She sees your face and sees only the men who took them from her. The explanation offered no comfort, only a deeper understanding of the bloody chasm that lay between her and these people. Later, when some of her strength had returned, Lyra sat beside her again. In her hand, she held the feathered token. "Kaelen found you carrying this," she said, her voice now holding a new, sharper edge. "It belongs to the people. Tell me how you came by it." Elara's hand flew to her neck, feeling its absence like a fresh wound. "It was my mother's," she whispered. "She gave it to me before she died. She never said what it was." Lyra's gaze intensified. "What was her name?" "Her white name. Elara Vance." Lyra's eyes closed for a long moment, as if listening to an echo from the distant past. When she opened them, there was a new light in them, a flicker of profound sorrow and dawning recognition. "Elara," she repeated softly, tasting the name on her tongue. "Before she was Elara, she was Tabeni, Sunlight Girl, my sister's daughter. She was taken during a raid on our summer camp, when she was not much older than you are now." The words struck Elara with the force of a physical blow, knocking the very breath from her lungs. Her mother, a Comanche, all the disjointed pieces of her childhood, her mother's strange, sad lullabies, her uncanny knowledge of wild plants, the profound, unspoken grief that always seemed to cling to her like a shroud, suddenly snapped into a painful, coherent, and terrifying picture. She was not just a white woman, an intruder. She was of their blood. But as she looked at the hard, unwelcoming landscape outside the lodge and remembered the pure hatred in Naya's eyes, she knew that blood was not a bridge. In this world, it might only be another cage. Part 3. The Serpent's Shadow. The days that followed bled into a grueling liturgy of survival, a painful and necessary baptism by which Elara Vance was stripped of her former self. Life in the Comanche camp was a constant, thrumming rhythm of physical demand, a cadence set by the sun, the seasons, and the collective need of the tribe, and Elara struggled to find her place within it. Under Lyra's patient, watchful eye, she began the arduous process of unlearning her old life to absorb a new one. Her hands, once soft and accustomed to the delicate dance of needlepoint and the rustle of hymn book pages, were now perpetually sore and stained. She spent hours kneeling on the hard-packed earth, using a heavy stone matat to grind dried corn into meal, a repetitive, punishing task that made her shoulders ache and awakened muscles she never knew she possessed. She learned to scrape the last stubborn vestiges of flesh and sinew from freshly tanned deer hides with an obsidian tool that felt clumsy and alien in her grip. Her skin blistered, then broke, then hardened into calluses. Her fingernails were chipped and permanently rimmed with dirt. She was being unmade and remade, molded by the very land itself. She learned that every plant had a purpose: willow bark for pain, yarrow to staunch bleeding, the root of the yucca for soap. She learned that every animal possessed a spirit that must be honored, and that no part of a slain deer was ever to be wasted. But the highest hurdle was the language, a cascade of percussive sounds and guttural stops that felt impossible on her English-trained tongue. The village children, with the guileless honesty of youth, would sometimes giggle at her halting attempts to form the words. Their laughter wasn't malicious, but it stung nonetheless, a sharp, painful reminder of her otherness. Yet, she persisted. Long after the camp had fallen into slumber, she would sit by the dying embers in her lodge, repeating the words Lyra had taught her, whispering them to the fire like a prayer. Tuhuya, deer; pa, water; kuma, husband, a word that brought a strange heat to her cheeks for reasons she refused to examine. Through all this, Naya was a constant, hovering shadow of disapproval. Her hostility was no longer overt, but had been honed into a subtle campaign of sabotage. A pot of stew that Elara had been carefully tending all afternoon would be found mysteriously scorched on the bottom the moment she turned her back. The sinew thread she was using to stitch a moccasin would be found severed, left in a frayed, useless tangle. Each incident was small, deniable, but they accumulated into a clear, painful message. You do not belong here. Elara never complained, never accused. She simply, silently, scrubbed the scorched pot and started again, found new thread, and patiently redid her work. Her resilience was a quiet act of defiance, a declaration that she would not be broken. Kaelen remained a distant, watchful presence. He rarely spoke to her, yet she often felt his eyes on her, a gaze that was not judgmental, but assessing. He moved on the periphery of her new life, a silent guardian she wasn't sure she had earned. One morning, after she had struggled for an hour with a dull scraping tool, she returned from fetching water to find a new one lying in its place, its edge honed to a perfect, razor sharpness. Another evening, as a cold wind whipped through the village, she saw him from a distance, securing a loose flap on the lodge Lyra had given her, his movements economical and precise. He never acknowledged these small kindnesses, and neither did she. They existed in a space of unspoken understanding. Their first true connection came not through words, but through a shared task. Lyra had asked them both to help stretch a massive new bison hide on a wooden frame. It was heavy, exhausting work, requiring them to pull in unison, their bodies moving in a coordinated rhythm against the immense weight and tension of the hide. At one point, her sore hands slipped, and she would have tumbled backward had he not reached out instantly, his hand closing around her forearm to steady her. His touch was firm, warm, and sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with the physical effort. Their eyes met for a long moment over the stretched hide. In his gaze, she saw none of the pity or condescension she had come to expect from the world, but a flicker of something else, something she hadn't dared to hope for. Respect. He wasn't looking at a fragile white woman. He was looking at a partner, someone pulling her own weight. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, and they returned to their work. No words were exchanged, but for Elara, it was a seismic shift. A single, silent acknowledgement from him was worth more than 1,000 words of welcome from anyone else. It was a sign that, perhaps, she was not just surviving here. She was, slowly and painfully, beginning to belong. Far from the sanctuary of the Comanche village, Silas Croft's patience was wearing thin. He sat in the smoky haze of the Redemption Gulch saloon, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his mood as foul as the cheap cigar clamped between his teeth. He was not a man accustomed to being defied. Elara Vance was no longer just a debt to be collected. She was an affront to his authority, a piece of property that had dared to have a will of its own. Her escape had made this personal. He slammed his glass down on the rough-hewn table, causing the other patrons to fall silent. "Find me someone who knows these lands," he roared, his voice thick with menace. "Someone who ain't afraid of ghosts and savages." A grizzled, one-eyed trapper, smelling of beaver pelts and desperation, was shoved forward. For a handful of silver dollars, the trapper told Croft about the Comanche wintering grounds, a series of hidden valleys to the north, notoriously difficult to find. It was a long shot, he warned, but it was the only place a person could disappear so completely. Croft was a man of calculated risks, not blind faith. He paid the trapper, then dispatched 2 of his most ruthless hands, a pair of brothers named Jed and Caleb, not to attack, but to scout. "Find their camp," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "Mark its location, its strength. Do not engage. I want to know exactly what I'm walking into. I will not lose her again." Jed and Caleb were like coyotes, cunning and cruel, and they moved through the territory with a hunter's patience. Days later, Kaelen, on a long patrol to check his trap lines, found their tracks. They were shod horses, moving with a stealth that was unusual for white men. This was not a lost prospector or a wandering cowboy. This was a threat. He followed the tracks for half a day, every instinct, honed by years of warfare and survival, screaming that danger was near. He found their camp in a small, sheltered canyon. From a high ridge, he watched them, his stomach tightening into a cold knot. They were studying the valley below, his valley, his home, with a spyglass. He had to stop them. He had to ensure they never returned to their master. Kaelen circled around, using the terrain to his advantage, the wind in his favor, planning to dispatch them in their sleep. But fate was not on his side. A loose rock skittered under his moccasin, a tiny sound that was nonetheless enough to alert the ever-watchful Jed. A rifle shot exploded the silence, the bullet splintering the rock next to Kaelen's head. The element of surprise was lost. Caleb charged from the camp like an enraged bear, a long-bladed hunting knife in his hand, while Jed took cover and began to reload. Kaelen met Caleb's charge head-on. The fight was brutal and primal, a whirlwind of desperate strength in the dust and snow. Kaelen was faster, more skilled, but Caleb was a brute, fighting with a wild, cornered animal ferocity. Kaelen managed to plunge his own knife into Caleb's ribs, but not before the man's heavy blade raked across his side, carving a deep, ragged gash from his hip to his ribs. As Caleb collapsed with a final, gurgling sigh, Kaelen staggered to his feet, blood pouring from the wound, his vision swimming. He saw Jed aiming the rifle for a final, fatal shot. With the last of his strength, fueled by an image of Elara's face, Kaelen threw his tomahawk. It spun end over end, a blur of wood and steel, and embedded itself deep in Jed's chest. Silence, abrupt and absolute, returned to the canyon. Kaelen leaned against a rock, pressing a hand to his bleeding side, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He had won. He had protected his people. But as he looked at the long, treacherous distance back to the village, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The cold was sinking into him, and the world was beginning to tilt. The journey home would be a battle in itself, and he wasn't sure it was one he could win alone. Part 4. A Scarred Allegiance. He returned not as a warrior, but as a ghost held upright only by sheer, stubborn will. Kaelen stumbled into the village clearing just as the evening fires were being lit, a specter of dried blood and dust, his face a pale, drawn mask of agony. Each step was a silent battle against the encroaching darkness of unconsciousness. He collapsed to his knees before he could reach the sanctuary of his lodge, a dry, ragged gasp tearing from his lungs. For a moment, the bustling life of the camp froze. A collective, horrified silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fires. Then, the silence shattered. Women cried out, and the other warriors rushed to his side, their voices a low, worried murmur as they saw the extent of the injury. Elara was by the stream, scrubbing pots with a yucca root, the simple, rhythmic work, a small anchor in her tumultuous new life. When the commotion erupted, a primal fear, cold and sharp, seized her heart. It was a fear she recognized instantly as being for him. She dropped the pot, which shattered unnoticed at her feet, and ran toward the gathering crowd, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pushed her way through the tightly packed bodies, heedless of the startled and annoyed glances, her world narrowing to a single, terrifying point: the fallen form of the man who had saved her. While others stood frozen in shock, Elara's mind, honed by weeks of Lyra's practical, no-nonsense lessons, went to work. She saw past the legendary warrior and saw the wound. A ragged, dark gash in his side, crudely bound with a strip of his own shirt, the fabric already soaked through with blood that was too dark, too sluggish. It was a wound that festered with every shallow breath he took. Lyra was there in an instant, her ancient hands, surprisingly steady, expertly probing the edges of the injury. The old woman looked up, her face grim in the firelight, the deep lines etched around her eyes seeming to deepen further. "The blade was dirty," she announced, her voice low but carrying over the worried whispers. "The white man's poison is in him. He will have the fever by morning." A wave of despair washed over the onlookers. Such a wound, from such a weapon, was often a slow, agonizing death sentence. But Elara refused to accept it. A fierce, protective instinct she didn't know she possessed surged through her, silencing her fear. Pushing aside the feeling that she had no right, that she was still an outsider, she knelt opposite Lyra in the dirt. "We have to clean it," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the collective anxiety and surprising even herself. "With boiled water and the willow bark poultice, and we need yarrow to stop the bleeding." Sevens. Lyra looked at her, a long, appraising stare that seemed to pierce right through to her soul. In Elara's eyes, she saw not the hysteria of a frightened girl, but the unwavering focus of a healer. She saw a determined woman, her eyes clear with purpose, ready to fight. Lyra gave a single, firm nod. The gesture was all the permission, all the acceptance Elara needed. While the other warriors carefully lifted Kaelen and carried him to his lodge, Elara moved with an urgency she'd never known. She became a whirlwind of focused energy, directing the younger girls to fetch the cleanest water from the spring and build up the fire. She herself gathered the necessary herbs from the store Lyra kept, her hands unerringly finding the willow bark, the yarrow, the crushed juniper for cleansing the air of bad spirits. Naya stood at the entrance to Kaelen's lodge, a rigid silhouette against the firelight, her arms crossed, watching Elara with a look of profound conflict. She saw the white woman, the source of all this trouble, now taking charge, her movements efficient, her commands respected. She saw the woman Kaelen had brought into their world, now fighting tooth and nail to keep him in it. For the first time, Naya's deep-seated hatred was at war with a grudging, undeniable flicker of respect. Inside the lodge, the air was thick with tension and the metallic smell of blood. Elara worked alongside Lyra, her movements becoming a mirror of the old woman's. She cleansed the wound with a tenderness that was almost a prayer, her touch gentle but firm, ignoring Kaelen's pained groans as she cleaned away the filth. This was more than just nursing a patient, it was a vigil. She was no longer the frightened survivor Kaelen had carried from the snow. In this moment, as she fought for his life, she was his protector. The roles had been reversed, and in that reversal, a bond that had been quietly growing between them was about to be forged in the crucible of fever and fear, destined to become either as strong as steel or to shatter into ash. The night was a long, suffocating battle against the encroaching shadows of death. Kaelen's body burned with fever, and the close confines of the lodge became a sweatbox, the air heavy with the scent of medicinal herbs and mortality. Lyra, her ancient strength waning with the passing hours, eventually had to rest, leaving Elara to hold the vigil alone. She sat by his side on the hard-packed earth, a small, determined figure against the vastness of the night, refusing to succumb to the exhaustion that pulled at her own limbs. She bathed his face with a cloth dipped in cool water, forced sips of a bitter, fever-reducing tea between his cracked lips, and changed the poultices on his wound with a devotion that went far beyond mere duty. He was her anchor in this strange new world, the one person who had shown her a quiet, profound respect, and she would not let him be swept away by the dark tide. In the throes of his delirium, the formidable walls around Kaelen's stoic heart crumbled into dust. He murmured in the Comanche tongue, his voice thick with pain and memory, his words a torrent of half-forgotten sorrows. Elara, with her still limited understanding of the language, could only grasp fragments, but they were fragments that painted a vivid, heartbreaking portrait of his soul. He spoke a name, Tia, over and over, a whisper of profound, heart-wrenching grief. He spoke of a raid, of the smell of smoke and the sound of screams, and of a small, wooden bird he had carved, now lost forever to the ashes of his past. He spoke of watching the light fade from her eyes, a light as bright as her name, Sunlight Girl. Elara didn't need to understand every word to comprehend the depth of his loss. She was not just tending to a physical wound, she was bearing witness to the raw, unhealed scars on his spirit. In these vulnerable, unguarded moments, as she wiped the sweat from his brow, she felt a connection to him so profound It ached in her own chest. She would soothe him with her own words, her voice a low, steady murmur, mixing the few Comanche phrases she knew with the gentle cadence of English prayers from a life that felt a century away. She spoke not to the legendary warrior, but to the grieving man, telling him he was not alone, that he was safe, that the sun would rise, and he would rise with it. Meanwhile, Naia's own turmoil drove her from the village. Restless and agitated, she paced the moonlit trails, her heart a knot of confusion and rage. She blamed Elara for the attack on Kaelen, seeing it as the inevitable, bloody consequence of welcoming an outsider. This trouble, this violence, had followed the white woman to their home like a curse. Her frustration led her to the camp of a traveling merchant, a smooth-talking mestizo named Rios, who sometimes traded with the tribe for pelts. She sought a distraction, a bottle of the white man's whiskey to numb the war that was raging in her thoughts. As they shared a drink by his fire, Rios, who was in fact one of Silas Croft's most trusted spies, expertly pried at her anger, his questions slick with false sympathy. "It is a great shame your strongest warrior is laid low," he said, shaking his head. "Especially now, with the sun dance ceremony coming. The other villages will need your best men to help with the preparations. No? It leaves your own camp vulnerable." In her anger and intoxication, Naia scoffed, her pride wounded. "Our strength is not in one man," she said carelessly, her words sharp with defiance. "But yes, many of our warriors will travel to the sacred buttes in 3 days' time. The main camp will be quieter, but we are never vulnerable." She said it as a boast, a fierce assertion of her people's resilience. She had no idea she had just handed Silas Croft the key to destroying them. She left Rios's camp feeling no better, the whiskey only souring her mood, completely oblivious to the fact that her bitter words had just set in motion a devastating plan of attack. Part 5. The River of Fire. With Elara's tireless, round-the-clock care, the fever finally broke. Kaelen awoke one morning to find the world return to a sharp, clear focus, the searing pain in his side now a dull, manageable ache. His first clear sight was of Elara, asleep in a sitting position by his fire, her head resting on her knees, her face smudged with soot and etched with a profound exhaustion that mirrored his own recent battle. In that quiet, dawn-lit moment, seeing the toll her vigil had taken on her, he knew that his life was now irrevocably bound to hers. The gratitude he felt was a current that ran deeper than words, a silent acknowledgement that she had not only mended his flesh, but had also fearlessly entered the fevered wreckage of his spirit and guided him back. The days that followed were filled with a new, unspoken intimacy. The barriers of race, of language, of caution, had been burned away in the heat of his fever. He taught her the right way to fletch an arrow, his large, scarred hands gently guiding hers. In return, she read to him from a tattered copy of Shakespeare she had inexplicably packed, her soft voice bringing the strange, beautiful words of star-crossed lovers to the firelit interior of his lodge, a magic he had never known. The rest of the village saw the change. The bond between them was no longer a question to be whispered about, but a quiet, accepted fact. As Kaelen regained his strength, the tribe's attention turned to the upcoming sun dance ceremony. Just as Naia had unwittingly predicted, a delegation of the tribe's most important warriors and elders, Kaelen now among them, prepared for the 3-day journey to the sacred buttes. Leaving the main camp under the watch of a smaller, less experienced guard was a necessary, time-honored risk. It was the moment Silas Croft had been waiting for. The information from his spy, Rios, was perfect. He had no interest in a prolonged, costly war with the Comanche. That was not profitable. He wanted a swift, terrifying strike that would break their spirit and deliver his prize. His plan was brutally simple and cruelly efficient. Create a massive diversion, snatch Elara, and take a high-value hostage to ensure no one would have the stomach to follow. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and rose, the attack began. It was not a full frontal assault, but a coordinated series of lightning raids designed for maximum chaos. Croft's men, moving like wraiths under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, set fire to several empty supply lodges on the southern edge of the camp. Simultaneously, another group of riders, hollering and firing pistols into the air, stampeded the tribe's precious horse herd, sending them galloping in a panic-stricken, thundering frenzy right through the center of the village. The chaos was instantaneous and absolute. The remaining warriors, roused from sleep and completely disoriented, raced to fight the spreading fires and to try and contain the terrified, stampeding horses. It was a perfect storm of confusion. In this carefully orchestrated pandemonium, Silas Croft and his personal cadre of men, their faces grim and determined, moved like surgeons toward their true objective. Elara had been awoken by the first screams and the acrid smell of smoke. Fearing for the children, she ran from her lodge directly into the path of Croft himself. His cruel, triumphant smile was the very image from her nightmares. "Did you miss me, my dear?" he sneered, grabbing her arm in a brutal, iron grip. Before she could scream, a dirty cloth was stuffed into her mouth. As his men began to drag her away, another group snatched their second target. A small, terrified boy who had run out of his lodge directly into their path, Tekka, the 6-year-old son of the village chief. The raid was over as quickly as it began. By the time the fires were brought under control and the last of the horses were calmed, Silas Croft was gone, leaving behind a smoldering, violated village and a stunned silence more terrifying than the noise of the attack. He had Elara, and he had the chief's son. In his mind, he had already won. The sight of Tekka, the chief's son, being hoisted onto a horse and carried away alongside Elara struck Naya with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted on its axis, and the whiskey-fueled bravado of her conversation with Rios curdled into a cold, sickening horror in the pit of her stomach. This was her fault. Her anger, her pride, her careless words had been the stones that paved the path for this devastation. As the warriors, summoned back by smoke signals, returned to the ravaged camp, their faces grim with fury, Naya pushed through the crowd and fell to her knees before Kaelen and the stunned chief. "It was me," she confessed, her voice choked with tears of shame, the words tearing from her throat. "I spoke with the traitor, Rios. I was angry. My foolish pride. It guided their hands to our heart." A wave of furious murmurs swept through the crowd, but Kaelen silenced them with a raised hand. He looked down at Naya, at her unbearable guilt, and he saw not a traitor, but a warrior who had made a terrible mistake. "Regret will not bring them back," he said, his voice hard as flint, but not unkind. "Action will." He pulled her to her feet, his grip firm. "Is there another way? A path they will not expect?" Sevens. A spark of desperate hope ignited in Naya's eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of its old strength. "The serpent's spine. It is a narrow, treacherous goat trail through the high mesas. They would not dare take it with their horses, but we, on foot, can move faster. We can get ahead of them. The plan was set. A large war party would follow Croft's main trail, a loud and visible pursuit to keep him looking over his shoulder. Meanwhile, a smaller, faster group, Kaelen, a now fiercely determined Naya, and two of their best trackers, would take the secret path. During the chaotic ride out of the valley, Elara had not been idle. Using a small sewing needle she had kept hidden in the hem of her dress, she had been painfully working at the thick ropes binding her wrists. As Croft's party slowed to navigate a rocky wash, she snapped the final strand, shoved the man holding her with all her might, and bolted into the thick brush. Her escape was short-lived. They caught her within minutes, but it served its purpose. It slowed the party down, forcing them to spend precious time hunting for her and allowing Kaelen's group to gain even more ground. They finally laid their trap in a narrow box canyon known as the River of Fire, named for its towering red sandstone walls that glowed like embers in the late afternoon sun. As Croft's men entered the canyon's mouth, a thunderous roar echoed from above. Boulders, pushed by Naya and the trackers, rained down, sealing the exit. The fight was quick and brutally tactical. Kaelen and the warriors engaged Croft's men with a focused fury, their primary goal, the rescue of the terrified Tekka. Naya fought with the ferocity of a lioness, her every blow a desperate act of atonement. Amidst the chaos, Elara saw her chance. She scrambled up a scree slope to confront Silas Croft as he tried to flee. This was never about a debt, was it, Silas? She shouted, her voice echoing off the canyon walls, sharp and clear. This was about my father. He found faith in that canyon all those years ago, and you found nothing but a bitter heart. You've spent your whole life trying to fill that empty hole with gold and power, but it's never enough, is it? You are still just a failed, lonely man. Her words struck him harder than any arrow, peeling back his layers of cruelty to expose the pathetic, insecure man beneath. He raised his pistol, his hand trembling, his face a mask of rage and shame. His resolve was shattered. In that single moment of hesitation, Kaelen struck, his war club knocking the pistol from Croft's hand. The fight was over. Tekka was safe, and Silas Croft was a prisoner, defeated not by a warrior's strength alone, but by a woman's unshakable courage. Part 6. Where the Two Paths Meet. The return to the village was not a triumphant procession, but a somber, deliberate one. The captured Silas Croft and his remaining men were marched into the central clearing, their hands bound, their faces a mixture of raw fear and sullen defiance. The entire tribe gathered, a silent, watching circle. The initial joy at the safe return of Tekka and Elara quickly solidified into a cold, simmering rage as they looked upon the men who had violated their home, burned their stores, and stolen their peace. The chief, holding his son tightly in one arm, called a council. The air grew thick with calls for vengeance. The warriors who had fought, the women whose lodges had been burned, all cried out for blood, a righteous anger that demanded satisfaction. "Hang them!" one man shouted, his voice raw with grief for a friend lost in the raid. "Let the crows feast on their eyes!" Another cried, a sentiment echoed by many. When the fervor reached its peak, the chief, his face a mask of stone, looked to Elara. She was no longer just the outsider, the half-blood, the rescued girl. She was a participant in their victory, a warrior in her own right, and her voice now carried weight. She stepped forward into the center of the circle, the firelight casting a warm, steady glow on her face. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried a strength that commanded the silence of the entire assembly. She began in Comanche, her accent still imperfect, but her words clear and heartfelt. "My heart sings to be home, among my family." Then she switched to English, forcing Croft and his men to understand every word of their sentencing. "You ask for their blood," she said, her gaze sweeping over the angry faces before landing on Silas. "And by the laws of vengeance, they have earned their deaths. But to kill them is to become like them. It is to let their hatred poison our own hearts, and to answer a fire with a fire until the whole world is ash." She paused, letting the words sink into the tense silence. "There is another justice. A justice of the wild, a justice of this land. Strip them of their guns, their knives, and their horses. Give them each one waterskin and point them east, back toward the world they came from. Let the desert they covet so much be their judge. Let them walk back to their world stripped of the power and pride they worship. For a man like this," she said, her eyes locking with Croft's, "to live in shame is a far greater punishment than a quick death." A profound silence fell over the crowd. Her proposal was audacious, a mercy that was, in its own way, a crueler and more fitting punishment. It was a justice rooted in Comanche wisdom, not white man's rage. The chief looked at Elara, then at the humbled, defeated Silas Croft, and he nodded slowly. "The woman speaks with the wisdom of our ancestors," he declared, his voice booming. The decision was made. Later that evening, after the prisoners had been sent on their long walk into ignominy, a great ceremony was held. The fires burned brightly, and the drums beat a steady, joyful rhythm. The chief himself brought Elara forward. "You came to us as a stranger, a lost daughter of a lost daughter," he proclaimed. "But you have shown the heart and spirit of a Comanche. You have fought for us, bled with us, and taught us a lesson in wisdom. You are no longer Elara Vance, the runaway. From this day forward, you are Nita." He repeated the name, and the tribe took it up as a chant, a wave of acceptance and love. Nita, Nita, the one who begins again. At the height of the celebration, Naya approached, her face cleared of all its old hostility and suspicion. She stood before Nita and bowed her head. "I was blinded by my grief and my fear," she said, her voice ringing with sincerity for all to hear. "You have shown me that strength is not in building walls, but in opening your heart. Forgive me, my sister." Nita pulled her into a fierce, tearful embrace. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. The two women, once adversaries, now stood together, a symbol of the tribe's own healing and acceptance, united under the vast, starry sky. The ceremony was more than just a renaming. It was an anointing, a formal weaving of Nita's spirit into the fabric of the tribe. Lyra, her ancient eyes shining with a pride that was almost fierce, approached and draped a beautifully beaded shawl over Nita's shoulders. It was a storyteller's mantle, a sacred honor bestowed upon those tasked with keeping the tribe's history, its laws, and its soul alive through the power of the spoken word. "You have a voice that bridges two worlds," Lyra said, her hand resting on Nita's shoulder in a gesture of profound blessing. "You will learn our stories, and you will speak them so they are never forgotten." In that moment, Nita's journey came full circle. The preacher's daughter, once defined by the rigid, written words of a single, holy book, was now entrusted with the living, breathing library of an entire people. Her past had not been erased. It had been integrated into a richer, more profound identity, a tapestry woven from two different threads. As the dancing and singing swirled around them, a joyous, pulsating celebration of survival and renewal, Kaelen made his way to her side. He did not speak at first, simply standing with her, their shared presence a silent testament to the impossible journey they had traveled together. The tribe, sensing the gravity of the moment, gave them a respectful space, their dancing slowing, their voices softening, their faces turned toward the two figures silhouetted against the great central fire. Then, in front of everyone, Kaelen took her hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not loud, but it resonated with a raw, honest power that stilled the entire village. "For many seasons," he began, his gaze locked with hers, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide, "my heart was a winter ground, frozen and barren. I walked a path of memory, surrounded by the ghosts of what I had lost. I was not truly living." His eyes drifted for a moment to the healing scar on his side, a physical reminder of the deeper wound she had tended. "You came into my life like the first thaw of spring. You were not afraid of the silence or the scars. You tended to my wounds, but you also healed the ones that no one could see. You woke the sleeping part of my spirit." Sevens. He turned then, to face the tribe, but he kept her hand firmly in his. His voice rang with a clear, unwavering conviction. "She is not just a woman I love. She is Mukini," he said, using the Comanche word for which there was no simple English translation. It meant more than home, more than family. It meant the center of his world. "She is my home." A joyous cheer erupted from the people, a wave of sound that was both a blessing and a celebration. Kaelen turned back to Nita, his expression soft and vulnerable, stripped of all its warrior's armor. He gently touched the feathered token at her neck, the object that had first connected them across an impossible divide. "Your mother's spirit guided you back to us," he said softly. "And now, let us begin our own story." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that was both a promise and a prayer. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, abiding peace, a joining of two souls who had been broken apart by the world and had found a way to become whole together. The story concludes not with an ending, but with a true beginning. Nita and Kaelen stand side by side before the sacred fire, their hands intertwined. She is no longer the girl who was sold, nor the woman who merely survived. She is Nita, the storyteller, the firekeeper, a bridge between two worlds. He is no longer the grieving warrior, but a man reborn in the warmth of a new love. Together, they watch the sparks rise into the infinite, star-dusted sky, their two paths, once so distant and divergent, now joined as one, stretching forward into the future they would build together, in the heart of the wild. In a land of dust and desperation, where a soul could be bought for less than a handful of gold, one woman's spirit refused to be sold. Elara Vance's harrowing journey from a preacher's daughter, betrayed in the very house of God, to Nita, a cherished storyteller and firekeeper of the Comanche people, is a raw and powerful testament to the indomitable strength of the human heart. She fled a life of certain servitude and ran headlong into an unknown destiny, facing not only the unforgiving wilderness, but the deep-seated suspicion of a people who had every reason to distrust her face, her language, and her past. She earned her place not through blood alone, but through sweat, courage, and an unwavering refusal to be broken by hardship or hate. Her love story with Kaelen, the stoic warrior haunted by his own tragic past, was not a simple romance, but a slow, profound healing for them both. He saved her from the snow, but she, in turn, fearlessly entered the winter of his grief and showed him the way back to the sun. Together, they faced down the ghosts that haunted them from within and the greed of violent men who threatened them from without, proving that the strongest bonds are not given, but forged in the very fires of adversity. This story teaches us that home is not merely the place of our birth, but the community that embraces our scars, the values that define our spirit, and the love that gives us a reason to fight. It is a place we choose, and choose again, every single day, a place where our true name is finally spoken. If you were moved by Nita and Kaelen's incredible journey of survival, identity, and love, then you have found your home here with us. We invite you to join our community at Wild West Love Stories. Subscribe and hit the notification bell for more unforgettable tales of forbidden hearts, unlikely heroes, and love that rises from dust and silence to defy an unforgiving world. Your next great adventure into the heart of the Wild West is waiting.